You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
And hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 57 of the Common Descent Podcast. Spring is upon us here in the Northern Hemisphere, and what better subject to talk about as spring approaches than flowers?
Yeah, it's fitting.
This episode, we are talking about the evolution of angiosperms, that is, flowering plants. Plants that produce flowers and fruits are the most common terrestrial plants by far on our planet today, but they haven't always been.
Nope.
And the origins of angiosperms are this long-standing mystery. Flowering plants are a huge deal. They have a huge modern diversity, and their origins are a fascinating subject. And this topic was requested several times by Robin and Jake and Jeff and Beth and our patron Lydia. Thank you all for your suggestions.
Yeah, popular topic.
Now, longtime listeners of the podcast will be saying, wait a minute, a plants episode? You guys don't do plants episodes yourselves? And that's true.
And you're right.
You are correct. Which is why we are very happy to announce that after the news, we will be joined once again by our friend Allie Baumgartner.
Woo!
Paleolorax, she speaks for the fossil trees. She's going to take us through the story of angiosperms. We're very excited to welcome her back. Allie is wonderful. She's a fantastic guest, so we're excited for that.
Absolutely. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yes, so stay tuned. But first, a few announcements. As always, a reminder that the podcast is supported in large part by Patreon. We have a growing list of patrons who support us financially and allow us to continue hosting and running the podcast. If you are a patron, you will get all sorts of cool goodies, so be sure, if you're a patron, make sure you check those out. Speaking of those goodies, there is, by the time this episode comes out, we will have released the 2018 Outtakes Reel for patrons. So look at that, and before the end of the month, keep an eye out for another bonus news.
Yeah.
If you are not a patron and you're looking for ways to support us, or if you are a patron and you want some merchandise, we have officially opened up a Common Descent podcast store. Link in the episode description on Zazzle.com. Get yourself a shirt or a mug or a phone case or a hat or something with our logo on it and show your support. A little bit of that money goes to us, and we get all of the brand recognition as you carry it around.
Be our billboards.
Be our billboards. One other thing, so a year ago almost, we did a live stream with two sloth scientists and did a live stream Q&A about sloths. It was on YouTube. It was a lot of fun. We have officially audioified it, and that will be showing up in your podcast feed. So keep an eye out for that, the Sloth Chat live stream audio.
We're finally releasing the audio to the public, so you all can hear it for the first time on your podcast devices.
It's coming out of the vault.
Yeah, put it to rest. Listen to the discussion.
Yes, we waited for the 1-year anniversary. It's not at all that we continued putting it off for 12 months and just not getting around to it.
Yeah, we kept going, sloth chat. Okay, sloth
right,
chat.
We got to do that. Hang on.
All
Let's
right.
finish. We got to finish Spotlight and Spooky and other stuff first. I think that's all of our announcements for this episode.
Yeah, that's all I can think of.
Which means it's time, before we get to flowers, for the news. Every episode, we pick a few items from news in paleontology, evolution, and related sciences, starting with whatever Will's brought.
I brought some new species of island mammals found in the Cayman Islands that are only like 300 years old.
Oh, that's fun. We like islands.
Islands are cool. And these are interesting because of what they entail and suggest and some of the evidence of how they were found. This is all new research by Gary Morgan et al., published in the Bulletin of the American Museum of Natural History. And we'll be linking to the press release by Zoological Society of London on Eureka Alert. So these new species of mammals identified on the Cayman Islands. For any of you who don't know where the Cayman Islands are, these are 3 islands, Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, and Cayman Brac, or Brock, in the northwestern Caribbean Sea. So this is, south of North America, near the Caribbean islands and Cuba, but not with them. They're kind of off to the side.
Are there caimans on the Cayman Islands?
No, there should not be. Not that I know
weird.
of. I know, right? There's crocodiles on the Cayman Islands.
Okay.
So close. I believe they're there today. I'd have to double check for sure what their range reaches to, but I'd be very surprised if they weren't. But we know they were there in the past because the remains of these mammals actually show signs of being digested by crocodiles.
Oh.
Which is why I clicked on this topic.
I was wondering. I was like, this seems like a strange one for Will to pick.
I clicked on it because the title said new species found after being digested by crocodiles, and then that was in like the first sentence, and then the rest of the article didn't talk about it again, which is still cool stuff. So we're still going to talk about it, but I was a little like, oh, swindled. The new species are 2 cousins of the Hutia, which are these large rodents. They look very much like nutria. They sound similar, but not for the same reasons. These are big rodents that live in the mangroves of like Cuba today, and so semi-aquatic. The Capromys pylorides lewisii and Geocapromys caymanensis. And then the third was a little shrew-ish mammal, probably insectivorous, called Nesophthontes hemisingulis. These were identified with both morphological and genetic features. They're recent enough because they're, like we said at the beginning, or like I said at the beginning, only like 300 years old or so. And so recent enough to do some genetic analysis. The analysis also shows that they most likely went extinct in the 1700s, which is not a date we're usually dealing with on the podcast, but it's kind of cool.
Except for episode 55.
Yep. And speaking of that episode, it is almost surely due to European settlers bringing invasive species to the island.
Yeah, it's rats and cats and things.
Syncs up way too close. So they say that they'd be very surprised, basically, if there were a different cause than humans coming in. In fact, a lot of the Cayman Islands have been devastated since then. Most of the native mammal species are no longer on the Cayman Islands. So things like the Cayman sloths and monkeys are no longer there. So Cayman Islands have been hit pretty hard, which is why these specimens become very interesting, because this actually gives us some insights into the patterns of island extinction. Especially the Capromys have been noted before they went extinct, we believe, because in 1586, Sir Francis Drake visited the Cayman Islands and described some animals that, quoting, were either described as conies, which I'm not sure what animal that refers to, but also little beasts like cats, they think may refer to these mammals.
Interesting.
So we may have actually, the settlers encountered and noted them before they went extinct, a while before they went extinct. And their closest cousins, as I mentioned already, are still found in Cuba. Same genus, just different subspecies. And that's interesting because that's 155 miles away or 250 kilometers away. So this is not like a crazy new animal, but it's giving us a look at some recent island extinction. It's also giving us a look at potential distribution. How did they get to the Cayman Islands? And how were they distributed among those islands? And why did they not survive there, but they're still found in Cuba, are all questions that could give us more information about how to chart island extinctions, which are still going on to this day.
Yeah, and how to prepare for further island extinctions.
Hopefully
which will continue to happen.
Yeah, adjust for the future.
I wonder how they identified that they were eaten by crocs. Was it... I assumed that it was etching from digestive acids.
Yeah, I couldn't find... I didn't go through the whole paper just because of time, but I couldn't find a mention of exactly what it showed, but they said it showed signs of digestion, which I would assume is etching. And I assume partial digestion, because a lot of crocs fully digest bone.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Right? It's fun.
Good stuff. My first bit of news is sticking with the recent trend of non-fossil things, not old things. This is about a modern evolutionary experiment.
Oh man, with these newses and our modern extinction episode, we're skewing.
That's true. Yeah, we're losing. We're falling off the train. We're off brand here.
And next episode, the Oregon Trail.
How exciting! This is similar to a couple of newses we've mentioned in recent episodes of modern experiments showing evolutionary trends. This one is fascinating. It is the evolution of lice on birds. In the past, we've talked about, animals in different environments evolving, watching them evolving in response to certain pressures. This is parasite evolution, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating topic that gets looked over a lot.
This is research by Sarah Bush et al. In Evolution Letters, and we'll have a link to an article by Ed Yong at The Atlantic. Feather lice are ectoparasites that live on birds. They live in the plumage of birds, and they eat feathers and skin, dead skin flakes and such. Sarah Bush herself is quoted in the article as saying there is, quote, pretty much one species of louse per species of bird.
That's crazy.
Like a lot of parasites, they are very specialized. Living on different types of birds, you will develop different features. Normally, the lice are this sort of yellowish color. If you've ever seen a louse, they look kind of like termites. They're this kind of pale orangish color. But they're known across different bird species to camouflage somewhat against the bird that they live in.
Cool.
And if you're wondering what a louse has to camouflage itself against, it's the bird. Because birds will preen. If they spot a louse, they'll snip it out of their feathers while they're preening. This experiment captured a bunch of urban pigeons, so your classic city pigeons, rock pigeons, from Salt Lake City, gassed the lice off of them with carbon dioxide to completely delouse them, and then experimented by placing lice onto the pigeons. Now, one thing that they tested that was mentioned in the paper, before they did the major part of the experiment that we'll talk about, they painted the lice different colors to test if the color actually affected whether they were preened. And they did, in fact, find that the lice that closely matched bird feathers were less likely to be preened. So it does seem to offer an advantage. So then they placed over 2,000 lice on almost 100 pigeons, ranging from white to black to gray feathers.
Wow.
And they let the lice live there on the captive pigeons for 4 years, which for the lice was about 60 generations.
Wow.
Plenty of time for natural selection. And then they measured luminosity of the lice. Basically, are they changing lightness versus darkness? They found that on the black-colored pigeons, the lice became slightly darker. On the white pigeons, the lice became much brighter. And on the gray pigeons, the lice stayed pretty much the same.
Beautiful.
So they absolutely did change over just 4 years to match partially the color of the bird. They even noted that they started to match, some of the lice started to converge with the coloration, the lightness versus darkness, that we see on other lice species that live on other birds. They compared the lice on the white birds had adapted a lightness that was very similar to a different species of louse that lives on a different species of white bird.
Cool.
Which is pretty cool.
That's fantastic.
And then, to test the effects of preening, they had a certain set of birds that they fitted little plastic clips on their beaks, which prevented them from being able to fully close the tips of their beaks.
Huh.
So they could still eat and stuff, but they couldn't quite close the beak, which means they couldn't preen lice off of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that on the birds that couldn't preen, the lice didn't change colors.
That's so great.
So it is absolutely an adaptation in response to preening, that if you're the wrong color, you're going to get preened, and the lice that are better camouflaged are reproducing and spreading their color traits. Really cool. Once again, very simple, very straight. Well, it's not very simple, but it's very straightforward with it's exactly the results we expect. And what a wonderful thing to be able to predict and then confirm experimentally.
Yeah, that's, once again, anytime we get just one of those really cool, we made an observation, built a hypothesis, tested the hypothesis, and then tested the results of that test is just so cool when you can just see it step by step. That's really awesome. One of the things that stuck on I knew parasites were very species specific. I didn't think external parasites would have been so much so, because like fleas just hop all over. You know, I know there are a bunch of different kinds of fleas, but like, you know, your dog could give your cat fleas.
That's true.
So like that, I'm surprised that external things, because like ticks just hop onto anything.
Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get these are specialized lice.
But with the results of the experiment, it makes a lot more sense, because now instead of hopping on and off, they're living on this animal. So that animal is their habitat, and they have to specialize to it. So it makes sense that you could absolutely have one population speciate just like that. If they were, if you would put one species of life on an island, come back, 100 years, there's going to be however many birds, that many lice. That makes sense. That's awesome.
And indeed, the paper describes the situation as the lice adapting to, quote, host islands.
Yes! Yes!
That each bird species is basically acting like an island.
Dibs on that D&D concept.
Ooh,
Dibs.
Yes. I'm excited to play in that game.
That's really cool. Nice. All right. Well, to take it away from the modern a bit and from the planet, I would like to talk about how studying our geology may be able to reveal patterns among the cosmos.
This is a weird news selection.
Yeah, it is, but they're cool.
Like it.
They're neat stuff. So we're gonna talk about the geological orrery.
What a good word, orrery.
It's a good word.
Listeners, do you know what an orrery is?
You've probably seen one, but they almost never use this term. This is that super cool, fancy, mechanical miniature of the solar system.
Yeah, like a model solar system that moves the planets.
And the really nice
around.
ones have gears so that things move in the right speeds and patterns in relation to one another. And so you could push Earth and everything else will move as it should.
That is called an orrery. That was an episode of Avatar where they had an orrery.
Yeah, where they discover,
they were trying to predict the eclipse.
They're trying to figure out when the eclipse happens so that they can invade the Fire Kingdom, and then they get chased out of the library.
Yeah,
that's the episode where Appa gets stolen. It's a sad episode.
Oh no. Anyway, news.
So this research is by Paul Olson et al. In the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and we'll be linking to the article by Viviane Collier in Smithsonian Magazine. So, a little bit of background for what they're building this idea off of. There is a very cool concept in climate science and astronomy called Milankovitch cycles. And this has to do with the fact that as Earth goes around the sun and other planets do the same and move near and away from Earth, and the moon orbits us and stuff's constantly moving all around us, they all have gravity, all of which affect the Earth. Mars, when it passes by, pulls on us a little bit. And when Venus goes by, it pulls on us a little bit. So this all affect the pattern of Earth's orbits. And there's three things that they look into. Eccentricity, which is the actual path we take around the sun.
Right, how oval or rounded our path is.
What shape our orbit is. The tilt or obliquity, which is what angle are we at on our axis.
Mm-hmm.
And the wobble, because believe it or not, the Earth wobbles. We are not completely motionless. Our axis can just bounce a little bit sometimes, and sometimes more than a little bit, or more than it usually would. And that's the precession.
Yeah, like a top. Precession is like when you spin a top, and as the top starts to lose its spin, it
spirals just a little bit.
Yeah, it starts the very top of it starts going in circles.
Our axis,
the Earth does that over time.
Pretty much, and it's pretty much constant, just not enough for you to like stand on the North Pole and be like, do you feel unsteady? I feel unsteady. It's not.
It's enough that the North Star has changed.
Yes.
Like 10,000 years ago or so, the North Star was a different star because we were pointing that the North Pole pointed to a different part of the cosmos.
And that's kind of what this is getting into, is that we have a pretty good understanding of how our solar system moves, but it's a very complex system, and it is very difficult to map that backwards because a lot has changed in our solar system from the day it was born to now. And some things in the solar system are very steady. Others aren't. Like, this is one of the reasons Pluto was demoted. Its orbit, sometimes it's the last planet, sometimes it isn't. It depends on what its orbit is doing at that time. So it can shift. It's not stable or as stable as other bodies. And we have, I'm sure everyone, is either seen a thing that, can show you what stars were in the sky on different dates, or is aware of the fact that we can calculate that. We've mapped the movements and we can turn the clock backwards. But every time we look back a little bit, we lose a little bit of clarity. We gain some errors in our estimates. And those errors build up to a point where after about 50 to 60 million years, looking back with that mathematical, system, it's pretty much useless. It's not reliable enough.
Fuzzy.
So they are hoping that by looking at our planet, they might be able to map a little bit more clearly the movement of our celestial bodies. And this is because as those Milankovitch cycles adjust, the tilt, the distance, the wobble, the shape of the orbit, all of those things affect the climate, because that's going to affect how much sun is hitting different parts of the Earth for how long.
Yep.
And sunlight is the driving force behind climate. It heats, it causes things to be cool when it's not there. So that's what changes our climate from time to time as these cycles change. If we look back through cores of Earth and figure out the patterns in climate in the past, we might be able to match those to how other things are affecting us during that time and causing the climate to behave that way. Thus, geological orrery. It's a big concept, but they went and looked at a couple of different sites. The two big ones were the Mesozoic Newark supergroup in New Jersey, which is like 200 to 227 million years ago.
Yeah, Triassic stuff.
And then
really
they looked
nice
at
Triassic stuff.
Yes, it's a famous area. They also looked at the Triassic section of the Chinle Formation in Arizona's Petrified Forest National Park. They took thousands of feet of core material from these sites, like literally thousands. So a lot of coring, a lot of looking through the layers, looking for climatic patterns of shifts. And one they found was a shift of monsoon cycles, of water levels in the lakes rising and falling due to increases in monsoons and decreases in monsoons over a series of years. And this matched up pretty well with what they expected from what they had predicted for movements of the solar system and how it would affect Earth. There was one little gap of 2 million years that just didn't quite fit. They were able to match it to a unique little temporary orbit pattern between Mars and Earth that came in every now and then to screw things up and then would leave again.
Fascinating.
And as they got more information, they were finally able to match this to a pattern between Jupiter and Venus, because they were able to date these seasonal patterns with the Chinle Formation using volcanic ash and zircon minerals, and so those could be radiometrically dated. We've talked about zircon before. That's how we dated our oldest rocks.
Yes.
And they found a 405,000 year cycle between Jupiter and Venus that has existed for about 200 million years, basically as it is today. And they were able to match that in these cores.
That's big.
That's big.
That's ambitious.
And it is. And people have come out to say, One person was quoted saying, "It is a very complex house of cards that isn't resting on sound scientific foundation," they claim. Because they pointed out that there are a couple of gaps in the timeline, in the stratigraphy of the two sites. Now, the team was able to go back and uranium lead date the Newark site to show it was a continuous sequence, so there might be some debate there. But the Chilean formation was put down by successive river sediment, so it's not necessarily consistent, which may mean that using that site to date the patterns at first identified at the other site may not be 100% reliable. So people have come out to say, cool, but also that's a lot, and you're not basing it off of a ton yet. It's kind of what they're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's several levels of inference there.
Yes.
That you're looking at the rock record to infer the climate, to infer the Earth's orbital pattern, to infer gravitational interactions of the planets. And there's a lot of things. For me, the big thing is that there's a lot that affects the climate.
Yes.
So then on the one hand, I'm like, that's very ambitious. There's a lot of room for error.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Paul Olson is a big name. And Paul Olson, I met Paul actually
cool.
a little while back. You mentioned they're working in the Newark Supergroup.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, Paul Olson named the Newark Supergroup. Like, he's been working there for decades.
And has been working on this concept for a while.
Yep. And so it's one of those where I'm like, well, this supposedly a very reliable scientist who does good work. On the other hand, this is a real big concept.
Yep.
So I will be interested to see what more they can do moving forward.
Absolutely. Now, even with the criticisms, Spencer Lucas was the person who initially pointed out those issues. He still says this is a very cool and good course of study, because looking into it from this point of view could be very important to help us understand why global climate changes. Because honestly, we don't fully understand how the patterns of global climate change are affected by all the things that affect them. You know, there's a lot to that. It's a big system, and sometimes there are times where we know it changed. We can't give you an answer as to why it changed.
Especially the farther back you go, that becomes harder and harder.
Absolutely. So lots of potential here. If this pans out with more studies, this could be a huge new area of study, which is awesome.
Yeah, very exciting.
I love it.
Well, the last bit of news, I'm going to bring it back. I'm going to bring it back recent. Right, just a few thousand years.
Reel it in.
This is a study by a group of linguists who are arguing that the change in humans' diets, thanks to the rise of agriculture, may have affected language.
Cool.
Yeah.
This is very you study.
This is very me study. I'm very excited about it. This research is by Damian Blasi et al. In Science, and we'll link to an article in National Geographic by Michael Greshko. So human dentition, typically, and for most of our human history, humans were born with a bit of an overbite in their jaws, like the front teeth kind of peak, move forward ahead of the bottom teeth. But as we eat and we grow up, the wear on our teeth tends to shift it to a more edge-to-edge bite. However, once agriculture started and we started eating softer and easier foods, because we're making foods for ourselves, less wear on the teeth means that adults tend to retain more of that overbite that they have as kids. The wear is not changing the tooth arrangement, which they suggest may have made it easier for us to make labiodental sounds. So here's a bit of linguistics for you. Labiodental sounds are sounds that we make when our teeth touch our lips. Specifically, in English, what we call F and V. So fa and va, to make those consonants, your teeth have to touch your lips.
You put your top teeth on your bottom lip and go
labiodental, lip, teeth. So they're suggesting that those sounds may have become more common as adults retain the overbite. To test this, they did a few things. First, they made models, biomechanical models, to test if that actually is true. And they found that an overbite makes it 29%, it takes 29% less energy to make a bilabial sound, F or V, with an overbite, which means that they're easier to say by accident.
Yes.
That it's easier to make that noise, which means it could slip into language. And they also looked at modern hunter-gatherer societies, which are not agricultural, right? They're not making their own food the same way that, farming societies are. And they found that F sounds are significantly less common in hunter-gatherer societies compared to agricultural societies. And they looked at a language phylogeny, an evolutionary tree of language, for Indo-European languages, because you can do that. You can link up languages and see where they diverged from and which languages are related to each other, same way you can do with species, kind of, similar at least. And they found in their predictive language evolution that labiodental sounds, F's and V's, became more common starting around 6,000 years ago or so, which is also roughly the time that dairy and grain farming became widespread. So they are suggesting that we have a few different pieces of evidence here that suggest there is a connection between those particular sounds in language and the agricultural-based diets of different groups of people.
That's really cool.
The idea here being that these sounds could start working their way into a language, that they argue that it might be that they were becoming stated accidentally.
Yes.
And then early on, they might not have been a big, they might not have been considered a different sound.
Mm-hmm.
But that as time went on and people realized, oh, hey, here's this new sound that we keep saying, maybe we can diversify how our language uses that sound, start to differentiate between them.
I love that, because that's basically a very complex way of saying that us growing our own food and not having to eat such tough food caused us to develop a speech impediment that we rolled into our language.
Kinda, yeah.
Which is the joke I was gonna make originally, and then you said that part, and I was like, oh, wow.
Well, and if you look at languages today, now I go on a little linguistic rant. If you look at languages today, like Spanish is an interesting case, where Spanish does not have a V sound, not really.
Mm-hmm.
It has a B sound similar to English, but it doesn't have a V sound, so if you accidentally made a V, it wouldn't really change the meaning of your word. Like in English, if you said bat versus vat, those are two different words with different meanings.
Yes.
But if you're speaking Spanish and you accidentally went va, presumably someone would be like, that was a weird pronunciation, but I still get what you mean,
yes.
Let's go on.
Yes.
Now, there are other people who have said that maybe, take it easy on this. And they've pointed out that on the one hand, language is very flexible, and that there are many cultural reasons why certain sounds might come about and become important or less important. Even difficult sounds, like it's not just about energy efficiency, it's about is it culturally significant, because then energy isn't going to make a difference.
Yep.
Especially because while technically it might be energetically easier to say F's with an overbite, the difference is not substantial.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't take a lot of effort. Also, people are generally always really cautious when trying to link biological factors with cultural factors, because then you start running the very dangerous road of pointing out that certain people are biologically better at certain things.
Yes.
Which is a dangerous path to go down historically. And in general, humans have the same biological tools for language. Even, there's variation, obviously, but for the most part, it's not a huge difference.
It's if you grow up learning how to do so, you can usually do it pretty darn well. We're not different enough to have that sort of distinction.
And we keep admixing.
Yes.
Which is the other thing that language can do, is we could just pick up stuff from other languages.
Yeah.
There's a lot of horizontal gene transfer among languages.
Well, I think about that with the whole thing this kept making me think of was accents. Is the same way that a b in Spanish could easily become a v, is the same reason that you can understand a Japanese person that has a very thick Japanese English accent. Because you still get what word they're forming, even if R's or L's are flipping, you still understand the word. Because really, the sound is similar enough that it's not actually that critical. If they suddenly put a P somewhere in Bob, you'd be confused, but that's not what's happening.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of cultural context to it.
Yeah.
Now, the last thing that these authors pointed out that I thought was really cool is, if this is true, right, if there is some biological input here, and we can start reconstructing how our biology affected our language, which it, seems reasonable that it may have had some contribution, we might be able to start reconstructing how ancient languages were spoken.
Oh, cool.
Languages that we know of through writings, but we don't have anyone who speaks them anymore. maybe we can start more accurately reconstructing how they sounded, which is a really cool idea.
That is really interesting.
So we'll see.
Cool.
Indeed. Well, that's enough of that. I got to go off on a little language tangent. Actually, I forgot to mention the example I was going to mention. I was going to do the Korean-Spanish comparison, and then I remembered that I forgot the much more closer to home one is that French has two oo's.
Oh, yeah.
In French, there's a difference between two and two. And in English, you'd be like, what? But they distinguish between them. But anyway, that's a whole other tangent. I'm going to stop now. It's time for the main event. Now we're going to go way back to the Mesozoic era to talk about the origins, evolution, and diversification of flowering plants with our friend Allie Baumgartner. Stick around after the break for some flower talk.
Yay!
Hello, Allie.
Hello!
Welcome back!
I'm so glad to be back!
We are glad to have you back. Now, before we do anything else, we should, in case people haven't heard you on the podcast before...
Which shame on you.
Who is this person, and why should we listen to what she has to say about flowers?
Well, my name is Allie Baumgartner. Supposedly, I am some sort of expert on this. So I am a PhD student at Baylor University in the geology department, and I study paleobotany, dabbling in a little bit of modern botany and paleoclimate research.
Yeah. Excellent. You may have heard Allie before on the podcast in episode 38, which was about grass. And then at the end of episode 45, Allie made a special appearance to answer one of our patron questions. Allie, this makes you the most frequent additional voice on the podcast. You have been on the podcast 3 times now.
It's like SNL hosts.
Yes.
Who's hosted more?
Yes. Do I get a trophy?
This makes you Steve Martin
It'll
now.
be in the mail.
Okay.
Keep an eye out for it.
Okay.
It's gonna be great.
All right.
Patrons, if you could send us some money to buy a trophy, that would be really cool. Allie, we are here today to talk about not just flowers, not just angiosperms flowering plants, but specifically the evolution of angiosperms, because it's such a huge topic that it deserves its own episode. But before we do that, of course, what is an angiosperm? What makes a plant an angiosperm?
So, defining an angiosperm, there are 2 ways to do it. You can basically either define it by what it is or what it's not. So, technically, an angiosperm, angio means vessel, and sperm means seed. So, it is a plant that has its seeds in a vessel, specifically the fruit. So it has these protected seeds. Gymnosperm, conifers, that means naked seed. So its seeds are just willy-nilly being spread all over there.
My.
I know it sounds terrible when you say it like that, but it's true. You know, they're not protected. And so, one of the nice things about fruit is that it protects the seed and it makes it easier and enticing to be dispersed. So it's not just things like apples and fruits and stuff like that. Acorns, samara, so like the helicopters from a maple, those are also fruits. And so there are many types of angiosperms. So it's anything that makes a flower into fruit. So even plants that aren't known for their flowers, like grasses, you don't think about, oh, those beautiful grass flowers. Those are still flowering plants because they make flowers and fruits. They just might not be like apple trees or things that we're used to.
Mm-hmm.
So every plant that makes a flower makes a fruit, and every plant that makes a fruit makes a flower.
Yes, because that's where this is literally the birds and the bees right here. Because that's how you pollinate and make fruit. So flowers are where fruit come from. So basically you have the flower, it's pollinated, the pollen goes inside, it fertilizes the ovule, and that develops into this fruit. So yes, these things always go together.
Okay, so what are some of the more nitty-gritty details of what makes. We don't have to go into all of them because I know there's a lot.
There's a lot.
If we were in biology class, what would the teacher explain is
the rest of the
traits?
episode is taxonomy.
Oh, no, we're not doing that. So there are so not just having the fruit and having the flower, also aspects of just the seed itself. You have a double integument, so you have 2 layers that are protecting the seed, and you have double fertilization. So that's basically what's like making fertilizing the seed and fertilizing the the fleshy part of the fruit. And then there's also aspects of the wood. So the wood in angiosperms is much more refined, you could say, than the wood of gymnosperms. So other plants that make trees, their wood is not as efficient in the way that you transport water and nutrients.
Oh.
Okay, so we're talking like pine versus oak.
Yes. And so if you were to look at the way that specifically like water moves through the plant, it's superficially the same. Water moves through the plant through tubes, but the way that it does that is different, because basically the way that it works in angiosperms is if something is damaged, it is easier to, if parts of the wood are damaged, it's easier to like block those off. Like, okay, we're not going to have anything to do with them anymore. It's harder to do in a gymnosperm.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are other things, but I am not as interested in them, so I don't know if I can give you an interesting explanation.
Oh, that's fine. I'm sure we'll get more into it in a little bit.
Oh, there's a lot.
But before we keep talking about angiosperms, what is the modern diversity of angiosperms? Once again, briefly, because I know that it's almost all of the plants.
Right. So, and that's the important thing to remember, is if you are thinking about a plant, there is a very, very, very good chance that you are thinking of an angiosperm. So, grass, most of the trees, unless you're thinking of a pine tree, it is probably, so oaks and maples and tulips and palms and most plants that you come in contact with in your everyday life are angiosperms, which means that in terms of modern diversity, with the exception of like the tundra taiga, where you do have these big conifer forests, most of the modern diversity, most of the modern biomes are dominated by angiosperms. Cactus is an angiosperm. Grass is an angiosperm. Most hardwoods, hardwood trees, those are angiosperms. So by and large, if you can think of an environment, it's full of angiosperms.
And if you look out your window.
Yes, unless you are in a cabin in the woods in, northern Canada, you're probably looking at angiosperms.
This sounds like those old horror movies. They may even be in backyards near you.
It's true. Your lawn is angiosperms.
So I guess maybe a better question, an easier question is, what are not angiosperms?
That is a very good question. So the groups that are not angiosperms, there is one other group of trees. So that's going to be your gymnosperms, and that's conifers, so pine trees. It also includes cycads, ginkgos. Basically, any tree that is not an angiosperm is probably a gymnosperm. And
those make cones.
Yes.
So you think you're pine cones, and they often will have needle.
Yes, they don't
evergreens.
always. They're not always evergreen, and they don't always have needle leaves. But that is a good generalization. If you ever want me to talk about gymnosperms, I can do that too.
Listeners, you heard that. You heard her.
But so those are the other tree groups. Then there's one more group of vascular plants. So vascular plants means plants that have a vascular system. So they are upright and off the ground. So that's going to be ferns, which most people are familiar with ferns, and lycophytes, which you're probably not familiar with. It's a very uncommon group now, but they are often called the fern allies. So they are closely related and similar to ferns. And then you have your non-vascular plants. That's bryophytes and hornworts and liverworts. So mosses and things that look like mosses. So these are non-vascular plants. They don't have a vascular system, so they don't have a water system to allow them to grow tall. They basically have to be really low and close to the ground because they cannot transport water up.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent. So then everything else.
Everything
is what we're talking about today.
Basically everything else. And so I keep talking about trees. I am biased towards trees. I like trees best. They're charismatic and cool. But you also have shrubs, which just tend to be smaller trees with more branches. So if you take
With
a
less
tree...
ambition.
Yes, exactly. If you take... They lack focus. So
Yeah.
if you take a tree and like scale it down and multiply the number of stems, that's a shrub or a bush.
All right.
And then you have herbaceous things. So when I talked about grass before, so these are things that do not have that secondary growth where it grows out and grows wood. So these tend to have a shorter lifespan, tend to live a year or so. So that's going to be like wildflowers, grasses, that sort of thing.
Cool.
Okay. Do you have a favorite angiosperm?
Oh, wow. That's hard.
That's mean.
I was not prepared for that.
This question wasn't on the list of questions that I sent to Allie.
I did
Pick
not
your favorite
prepare for this.
child.
I know. Well, okay. I can tell you what my favorite scientific name is for an angiosperm.
That'll do.
It is the sweet gum tree. It is liquid amber Styraciflua. And the reason it's called
Oh, that's
liquid
cool.
amber, I know, right? It's such a good name.
That's a good name.
Liquid amber is the genus.
Yes.
Liquid amber. Yeah.
Liquid amber. And it's because it has this beautiful golden resin that comes out of it. Yeah.
Ooh.
I know, right? And sweet gum, I also like sweet gum trees in general. They have really pretty leaves that look like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I didn't watch the movie as a child because I'm a terrible paleontologist.
Tree stars.
Tree stars. It looks like tree star leaves. That's it.
Will was on top of it.
Sweet gum trees, their leaves look like they look sort of like tree star leaves, and then they have these really funny fruits they're called gumballs. It's a sweet gum tree, and they're about the size of a golf ball, a similar texture. They can be kind of spiky looking.
Oh,
My
yeah.
cat loves to play with these.
I played with those. When I was a kid, we had one
Yeah.
of those in my yard somewhere at one house, and I remember those.
Yeah, they're very common in the southeast of the U.S. I love sweet gum trees.
All right, yes.
Nice.
No, I am
We
there
have
with
sweet
you.
gum.
I didn't realize what they were, but yeah, those are awesome.
You learned something.
We have sweet gum at the Gray Fossil Site.
Yes. Yes.
Because
yes.
that's where I learned the genus liquid amber. Liquid ambar.
Yes, ambar with an
Ambar.
extra A.
All right, so that's some modern talk, but let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to the Paleozoic, right? So we're hitting 300 million years ago or so and earlier. Before there were angiosperms, what plants, if we're walking around in a Carboniferous forest or a Permian forest before angiosperms really show up, what kind of plants would have been the big deal vegetation?
Well, let's go back even further.
Oh, sure.
ho.
Yeah.
Go right ahead. You take the reins. Allie, take the wheel.
Botanist here. So if you go back to like the Silurian or the Devonian, that's where you're going to get your earliest land plants. And so that's where you're going to have like Rhynia, so from the Rhynie chert, and that is basically a little bit more than a stick. So there's not much going on. So you're not really, the earliest plants tend to be very small. They're not very well vascularized. They tend to be in these wet environments, so they don't have to move water very far. So that those early plants, they don't have seeds, they have spores. So those groups are not really represented by any analog today. Those are gone. And then through time, we then, as we get into those coal swamps and the Carboniferous, that's when we begin to see things that superficially look similar to what we have today. There are trees, but there are no trees like what we have today. So you have these, related to ferns and related to these lycophytes, these fern allies. So they're vascular plants, but they don't have seeds. They are still these spore plants. So basically just sending out their reproductive bits into the ether and hoping something good happens. So that's what we're seeing in throughout the middle to end of the Paleozoic. And then when we get into it towards the end of the Paleozoic into the Mesozoic, so into the Triassic, that's when we see the rise and the spread of gymnosperms. So that's going to be your ginkgos, your conifers, and your cycads. So they had their day. So this is when we see the rise of these large seed plants. And there are other seed plant groups. There used to be seed ferns that are no longer around today. But yeah, so that's what really dominated at the end of the Paleozoic and the beginning of the Mesozoic. The dominant feature of the landscape is going to be these gymnosperms. So if you think about dinosaurs, you're probably not going to have any grass. That wasn't really widespread until much later. You are going to have some flowering plants, but probably not for most of the time that you have dinosaurs. It's going to be ferns and cycads and conifers.
Cool.
Yeah.
So in the Triassic, we've got, our earliest mammals and turtles and dinosaurs and stuff are growing up without angiosperms at all, with those gymnosperms and friends.
Right.
When do we see the first angiosperms, and what do those look like?
That is a very good question, and that is a very hard question. Because the short answer is meh. The long answer is...
All right, thanks for coming, everybody. This has been a great episode.
So
I learned a lot.
It depends on what method you're using to determine what the first angiosperm is. So if you're looking at the molecular clock, early molecular clock estimates were anywhere from Permian to Cretaceous.
Okay. So molecular clock is DNA. We're estimating how long it would take for that divergence to have happened from DNA differences.
Yes, and if you look at DNA from the chloroplast of the cell, it could be as early as the Carboniferous.
Wow.
Right. So the recalibrated molecular clock estimate is late Jurassic, between 188 to 141.
All right.
Okay.
So that's if you're using the recalibrated molecular clock. So that's when they took more of the fossil evidence and reincorporated and kind of recalculated it.
A slightly more narrow band.
Yes, and it's more in it's actually much more similar to what we're seeing in terms of the fossils. So if you look at the pollen record, the earliest pollen that is angiosperm-like is from the late Triassic.
Okay.
But again, that is angiosperm-like, so it still might not be. The earliest pollen that we are very confident is angiosperm is from the early Cretaceous. And that means that if we're finding it in the fossil record, it has to already be there.
Yes.
We're not ever going to find the first one. So that late Jurassic estimate seems very reasonable given that our earliest pollen is from the early Cretaceous. And our earliest macrofossil is also from the early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago. So that's Archaea fructus, and that means ancient fruit.
Nice.
Is this the one that came out there was a plant that came out just recently. We talked about it in our news that was suspected to be an even earlier angiosperm.
Right. No. So Archaea fructus is pretty. There's not much contention with that. So every time you push it back, people are like, let's double check this. So this is without a doubt. We are very confident that this is. There are probably earlier ones. But this is the earliest one that we know without. I say without a doubt. It's still paleontology. We don't. Yeah. We have doubts. But it is early Cretaceous, about 125 million years ago.
That we know well enough to not use air quotes every time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Exactly. And so that's the when. The where is also hard to figure out. So there are three hypotheses to where what part of the world angiosperms first started. Some people put forth that it could be the Arctic. There's Triassic pollen from Norway that might be angiosperm. It resembles angiosperm pollen. It can be hard to say from pollen. And if they originally arose in the Arctic, that could explain the lack of fossils. because it's not.
Okay.
You have this bias against it, but it's not. There's not a lot of fossil evidence for that, so it's not a very convincing argument. There hasn't been a lot of support for it. Another idea is that they arose in North Africa. So somewhere between the equator and 25 degrees north latitude, because that's where a lot of the earliest pollen is coming from, like Morocco, even into Israel. But again, that's just the pollen that we're finding. So again, like this isn't really concrete. It's not well supported. The most, probably the most well supported idea of where the angiosperms first came from is the tropics. So today, the tropics are the center of modern diversity of angiosperms.
Yes.
And just because it is the center of modern diversity, you can't necessarily assume, but that's also where we're getting, we are getting fossils from there, and also the basal angiosperms. So the modern groups that are most similar to the early angiosperms are found in very high percentages, really high proportions in the tropics, specifically in Southeast Asia and Southwest Pacific Islands. So,
Right. Okay.
so the thought is that if we have all this diversity here and we have the oldest groups here, maybe that's because that's where they came from.
Right.
So we're still trying to figure that out, but that's the current idea.
That's like, I know it's something that obviously if they started, they had to start somewhere.
Right.
But until you were saying it, I didn't think about how weird a concept it is for it to be like, oh, have you seen the angiosperms that are only right here? Like, that's such an alien, very much like when we talked about grass, where it's an alien idea to picture a world devoid of grass. Like,
Right.
what do you carpet with if you don't have grass? It's angiosperms.
What's your
kinda
lawn
has,
made of?
Yeah, like angiosperms kind of has that same feeling of like just finding them in one area of the world. My brain just always kind of treated of like, and then like at some point there were angiosperms, but I can't picture there not being angiosperms because they're everywhere.
Right.
That's such a weird concept of them being in one little area.
Right. And well, that's because like that's easy to do, right? Because plants are kind of the green background.
Yeah.
And so you never really think about like, where did they come from?
Mm-hmm.
And even today, so some of the research that I do is looking at how groups of plants that have origins in different parts of the world, so whether or not they are more Gondwanan, so they have a southern hemisphere origin, or they're more Laurasian, so more northern hemisphere, and how they have these different relationships with climates. Which is really interesting because that's not something that people normally think about. We think about that with animals, but we forget
exactly.
that plants
Right.
do the same thing.
Well, and because since plants don't, go on migrations,
Well, they do, but very slowly.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't watch the annual conifer migration.
The mass sponge migration.
Yeah. So since they're not moving in that way, they literally grow to where they're going.
Right.
Right. It's a weird. You have to kind of rewire the way you think about distribution.
Yeah, and not even just like where in the world is Carmen Sandiego of these plants, but what kind of environment. So we also don't know that. So we have again a couple of ideas. So there's the possible herbaceous origin, basically that they were the idea that they were small and they were basically weeds and they lived in the understory and then burst forth when they got a chance. And there is some support to this, but it's mostly the absence of not support. So there's very little angiosperm wood from the earliest, so the idea is like, well, maybe they weren't making wood. Their seeds tended to be small and thin. They had small leaves. They seemed to be like what we'd expect if they were weedy, but the record is biased towards these riparian environments, these river environments. That's where you get fossils. and that's not the environment where we find a lot of our basal angiosperms. So maybe that's not where they started. My favorite hypothesis is, I just like the name. It's called the dark and disturbed hypothesis.
Ooh,
I know,
very nice.
it's so good.
The evanescence hypothesis.
Yes. And that's basically the dark and disturbed hypothesis is basically that these plants were living in these understory, low light, closed forest, wet, disturbed environments that had a lot of flooding, and that's based on Amborella, which is this basal angiosperm, this modern angiosperm that is one of the most, it's one of the oldest members of the group. But again, we don't have a fossil record that actually supports this. It's just based on the modern, maybe that's where it came from. And then the last potential origin is the aquatic origin. So Nymphales is another group of these basal angiosperms, these really old angiosperms. So Nymphales is the water lilies. So water lilies are aquatic. And so possibly there has been some discussion that possibly Archaeofructus, that earliest confirmed, yes, we're pretty sure you're an angiosperm, is actually part of that group, is part of Nymphales. If that's true, then that would lead, that would help support this aquatic origin. As it stands, there is phylogenetic support for all three of these origins. There's only fossil evidence to support the herbaceous and aquatic origins. In other words, we don't know.
This would be the equivalent of the aquatic angiosperm hypothesis.
Not quite.
It's funny because we've done a few different origins episodes. We did humans, we did birds, we did whales. Episodes 18, 37, and 41. And each of those, it was nice because we were able to say, here's all the steps. Here's all the steps we see in the fossil record. This wonderful, beautiful transition. This discussion's starting to sound a lot more like when we talked about snake evolution.
Yes.
Where it's like, there weren't snakes and there were snakes, and here are our ideas that we're not sure which one is right about where they came from.
And that's not surprising if you think about the fact that both plants and snakes have a much lower preservation potential than a lot of other groups.
This is very true.
I was explaining this to one of my students yesterday, actually, that while plants preserve much better in the fossil record than most people think, because most people think that they don't preserve, so it is greater than 0, it's not nearly as high as, say, bone. They have and wood. If you get wood, there are people who work on wood, and you can say things based on wood, but it's not the best way to identify a plant. In fact, the best way to identify a plant is based on its flower. So, angiosperms. Okay. But yeah, the best way
angiosperms must be very convenient.
Yeah, so the best way to identify an angiosperm is by its flower, because the wood can be super variable and can be very similar between distinct groups. Same thing with leaves. Leaf shape is super variable, so looking at the leaves can't necessarily help you identify it. But flowers are super ephemeral, right? You're only going to have flowers whenever it flowers. So spring, fall, whatever. So, leaves might be on the tree all year round, and they periodically drop them, or they don't, but, they are on the tree all year round, and they make a whole bunch of them. But flowers often don't fall off the tree. They often just kind of turn into the fruit.
Yeah. So
unless you preserve it when the flower is flowering, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And especially if these things, or if they originate in places that aren't going to be preserved, and they aren't made of something that's likely to be preserved, it just compounds it that. But looking for the earliest angiosperm there's a lucrative thing to look for, because I have seen so many papers. You have talked about these papers. I've been to talks. People are really interested in finding the earliest angiosperm, because it's not something we know about, and you got to have that money shot of showing the reconstruction of the flower.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's when you know you've made it.
Interesting.
Is there much in the way of a transition in the fossil record of angiosperms? Like, do we see the gradual development of familiar traits?
Not really. So Archaeofructus, it is a little bit more, like you can tell that it's it's older, but it still looks like an angiosperm. And that's the thing. So like even in the Cretaceous, honestly, the biggest difference between early angiosperms and later, modern angiosperms is that my colleagues and I joke that in those early angiosperms were just trying everything. So you have all sorts of shapes, and we're just gonna test this out. So for example, early sycamores, sometimes you would have just a single leaf, and sometimes they would be compound, and sometimes they would be lobed, and sometimes they would have more lobes or fewer lobes. They're just testing everything to see what sticks. And then as time goes on, you have groups beginning to be more limited in the shapes of their leaves and things like that. But by and large, there are no angiosperms, and boom, we got angiosperms.
So the time period that we're in now, right? We're in that late Jurassic into the early Cretaceous.
Mm-hmm.
So to set the stage for this time period of origins, we are smack dab in the middle of the age of dinosaurs. This is also the time that we see the origin of birds. So the numbers we've been citing here are the same numbers we've been citing. We were citing in episode 37 about bird evolution. This is also when you start to see this big shift in dinosaur terrestrial faunas from the Jurassic groups into the Cretaceous groups, and you start to get, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I assume, some more specialized herbivorous dinosaurs. That's a little bit of foreshadowing.
Nice.
So this was a dynamic time.
Yes. Well, and if you think about it, it would make sense that you're going to be seeing all of these changes in the fauna because you have these changes in the flora, right? Because that means you're getting these new environments that somebody's got to try out. So you're seeing this diversification of both these animal groups and the plant groups at the same time, which is cool.
It makes sense. I mean,
Yeah.
that you expect to see that because plants are kind of important for the food chain.
A little bit.
We are I say we, I'm not a plant.
Oh, we're learning something about Allie.
I wish I could
there's
photosynthesize.
Pamela Alley.
She's dark and disturbed.
Yes. No, but it's true. And also, once you get into the Cretaceous, you're getting pretty close to something you would recognize in terms of the orientation of the continents they're getting
Mm-hmm.
closer, right? You're seeing, like the sea in the center of North America is going away. You're beginning to have a modern orientation of the continents. You're having the modern groups are becoming more common. And so we're beginning to get to something that if you were to get out of your time machine, apart from the very large dinosaurs, would sort of seem normal.
Yeah. Just once again drives home because, so often people group all the Mesozoic together and all the dinosaurs together. It's like it went from an alien landscape at the beginning of the Mesozoic to something that you could have seen yourself gardening.
Yes. Yes.
And that's significant. Like the entire backdrop of the world shifted.
Right. Because, you're in the Paleozoic and it is a foreign world. And then as you move through the Mesozoic, you're getting closer to home. And then by the time you're in the Cenozoic, this is basically normal.
What's really interesting about this sort of origins mystery is that, and one of our requesters actually requested it this way, who requested this topic, Darwin referred to it famously, the origins of angiosperms, as an abominable mystery. And that was 150 years ago.
And I agree with him. Because...
The smart guy, that Darwin.
I know.
Episode 28.
He's going somewhere. But... yeah, we still have so many questions. We don't really know what they actually looked like because most of the best way to actually know you're looking at an angiosperm is by looking at the fruit or the flower. And so it can be really difficult to have an idea of what the rest of the plant looks like. We're not 100% sure who they evolved from. They're probably a sister group to gymnosperms, so they're cousins rather than one leading to the next. We don't know where they came from. We don't really know when they came from. So there's a lot. It is still a mystery. And there's still a lot that we need to do. So we need funding so that we can go out and dig up a whole bunch of rocks to try to find these things.
Absolutely.
So let's get talking then about angiosperm fossils themselves, what they look like, what sort of fossils we know, after this short break. So, the origins of angiosperms are an abominable mystery.
Yes.
But I'm curious to know, what do angiosperm fossils look like? How do you know when you see a plant that you're looking at an angiosperm?
So the best way, like I said before, the best way to tell that you are looking at an angiosperm is if you have a flower.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because there are, by and large, many other aspects of angiosperms can look very similar to some groups of gymnosperms. So in North America, when we think of conifers, we think of needle leaf evergreen. And there are some deciduous conifers even in North America, but in other parts of the world, there are broadleaf conifers. So the conifers have leaves that we would associate with angiosperms. So
right.
Having a broad leaf is not necessarily a good indication. Really, the only way that you can tell that you are looking at an angiosperm is if you are looking at the fruit or the flower.
So flowers nowadays, most people recognize as being a tool to entice pollinators.
Yes, it's true.
What did flowers before pollinators were widespread? Like, cause were flowers a big thing before pollination interactions were widespread, or because I know that like the pollinator symbiosis was something that kicked off at one point, but I don't know, were there many flowers before that? Were they doing something?
Well, actually, kind of. So there are other groups that have things that are similar to fruits and flowers. So the Bennettitalians, which is an extinct group that we're not quite sure who they're related to. Oh. It could be gymnosperms, it could be angiosperms, they could be their own thing separately. But they have basically these superficial fruit flower organs. They're not the same as angiosperms, but they sort of fill the same role. This is not the first time that a plant was like, it would be great if I had a little bit of help. So even before angiosperms, there were groups that would try to entice animals to do them a solid.
Neat.
Huh.
Yeah.
What are the features? So we read in that the new potential earliest flower that we reported on in the news in episode something or other. I don't remember the news.
What?
They were talking. I know. I have the topics. I don't have all the news.
Yeah, the news is hard.
That's fair.
They were talking about the seed.
Yes.
So you can tell an angiosperm seed from, say, a gymnosperm seed, I assume, because that's what defines the groups.
Right, exactly. So it's so like I mentioned at the beginning, so in the seed you have this double integument. So you have two basically skin layers on the outside of the seed, and you'll have double fertilization for that reason. So having a double integument is a good indication that you are looking at an angiosperm seed. However, that's, while you can do that, that's not going to be a particularly common way, just because the amount of technology you need to be able to see that, because you will either need to actually cut the seed or scan the seed in such a way that you can see the double integument layers.
Okay, so this is super microscopy, X-ray scanning.
Yes,
well,
hard.
Speaking of super microscopy, earlier you mentioned the earliest angiosperm pollen.
Yes.
How do you tell angiosperm pollen from other plant pollen?
Yes, I was going to ask that too.
So
it's on a bee.
Okay.
It's being carried by a bee.
This is the part where I'm going to refer to my Introduction to Paleobotany class notes.
Yes.
Because I don't remember off the top of my head. But I have my notes here for this very reason. Yes. Okay.
For the listener, Allie is holding a book that has plants on the outside of it.
It's true.
And many pages.
I filled it. Okay. So the long answer is that it has triculpate pollen. So that
of course.
That refers to the shape. I do not work with pollen. I work with leaves. But it is the shape of it. And also, if you have the pollen structure, so not just the pollen grains, but if you actually have like the part of the flower or the cone that has the pollen in it, you can actually see based on like how it's arranged. Like, this is not what I do.
Okay.
But
how it's sort of held in the plant before it's released.
Exactly.
How they store it.
Right, exactly. But the thing about it, it's basically it is much harder to say for sure that this is an angiosperm based on the pollen. So there are some types of pollen that, some shapes of pollen that are super distinct. Like, pine pollen looks like Mickey Mouse. So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that picture before.
Yeah. So that's the pollen grain that, most people know. But other groups, can be a lot more variable or just less distinct. And this is going to be old. Not that really matters. Pollen is basically indestructible. But it's, again, this is mostly based on, being an angiosperm is primarily based on having, these fruits and flowers. So the pollen isn't necessarily going to be the best way, to identify it.
Okay. That's good to know. It really does. We keep reinforcing this point that all the convenient stuff is not identifiable stuff.
Right. So the most commonly preserved part of a plant is the leaf. And the leaf is one of the worst ways to identify a plant. That's what I use.
I feel like that's probably got to be like if someone were to come back after their time machine trip and be like, well, I got you a few hairs.
Yes, exactly.
For you to identify visually.
Yes, that is precisely it. It's something that you shed a whole lot of, but it can be super variable. Like, what if you permed that day? Now we think you got curly hair, but that's not real. Yeah, it's just like that.
So what are some famous angiosperms from the beginning of angiosperms? What are some, all of our origin stories have these famous
the big names.
Archaeopteryx and Ardipithecus. Who are some of the superstars of early angiosperm evolution?
Well, there's Archaeofructus that I mentioned before to go with that A pattern of those, important ones.
Yes.
So, Archaeofructus, again, that name means ancient fruit. So that is the earliest. We're pretty sure that is actually an angiosperm. That was found in China, and if I remember correctly, they have multiple parts of this. So they have found multiple. Nice. Yeah, they found multiple specimens. They found multiple parts. So we can be pretty sure actually an angiosperm. The earliest could be angiosperm macrofossil is San Miguelia. And that's from the Triassic of Colorado.
Oh.
But there's not a lot of material. It seems like it looks like it's an angiosperm, but it could be one of these more derived gymnosperms. We don't have a fruit.
Okay.
There are things
There's tricky gymnosperms.
Exactly. there's been debate. We think it might be a fruit. We think it could be a cone. It's unclear. But also, Triassic would push back the origin substantially, especially considering what we expect from the molecular clock. One other early, like famous early angiosperm could be an early angiosperm is Nanjinganthus. So this is from China. This is from the early Jurassic. So this is about the it still falls within what our molecular clock would estimate at about 174 million years ago. Again, they found a possible fruit, but work that was published this year suggests that it's probably more closely related to conifers, that it's probably more of a cone than a fruit. Because if you, it can be really hard to tell the difference between a cone and the fruit depending on the type of preservation that you have. Because they're basically the same thing. They are a way of protecting your seeds.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, is they're conceptually the same purpose and idea. So if you had a softer looking cone, I could see how that'd just be like a weird looking fruit.
Right, exactly.
Especially if it's smushed and, fossilized. And...
right. You got some taphonomy going on.
Yeah.
Well, and a fruit has to have started somewhere.
Right, exactly.
So if they evolved from gymnosperms or something like gymnosperms, you would expect to see transitional stages.
Right, something that looks probably a lot like a gymnosperm. And that's going to make it harder to be able to say, like, where along this transition do we say, and these are angiosperms.
Right. So
it makes it hard. There aren't, every few years, there is a new oldest flowering plant. Which means that we're constantly adding things to the list, and then there more studies suggest that maybe not. But Archaeofructus is pretty much like, yes, we can be pretty confident of this, and I bet you that no one if I were to walk out to the street right now, no one would have heard of Archaeofructus, which is kind of sad.
Dear listeners, let us know if you had heard of Archaeofructus before this episode. Because you've heard of Archaeopteryx.
Yes.
Let us know if you had heard of Archaeofructus before this episode. We will find out.
Did you know?
Absolutely.
Did you know that there is an early tree, not an angiosperm, but an early tree, one of the earliest trees, that was called Archaeopteris?
Yes.
I love it. Literally 2 letters different.
Yep.
So I'm just going to pretend that you're not talking about the silly bird thing, but you're talking about a tree.
That's fun.
I wasn't. I was talking about the cool thing.
The cool thing. The tree.
Are there, speaking of cool things, are there other, beyond the origin story, are there other famous angiosperm fossils?
So, really, not a lot. Because, there's not a lot of taxonomy that's been done in this because it's hard. So if you've ever heard of the fossil plant Calamites, Calamites is related to a horsetail. And that name is based on the stem. There is Stigmaria, which is based on what we found out was the roots, and Anularia, which we found out later was the leaves. So different parts of the plant can have different names, and we run into that a lot. So it's hard to say all of these things are the same thing. So there's a lot of redescribing and saying, hey, that thing is actually related. It's actually like the fruit of this thing. These are the leaves. We found them connected. But one, I would say, famous fossil angiosperm is Paranymphea. So Paranymphea is a fossil ancient water lily. So it's and it is probably actually an emergent aquatic. So emergent aquatic means that it is emerging out of the water. So like a water lily sits on top of the water, emergent aquatic.
Okay, so it protrudes.
Yes.
Up out of. Okay,
yeah.
You said emerging out of the water, and I was picturing like a sea monster crawling up, actively coming up out of the water.
These are plants. They do less moving.
That's why I was confused.
But so the cool thing about
My God, that's horrifying.
I don't like this. Oh, thank goodness it's extinct.
you don't. Oh, I probably shouldn't tell you about Venus flytraps and things like that. That they do move.
No, you shouldn't.
It
That's
eats
a whole
what?
other episode.
Uh,
They live on what planet?
but one of the cool things about Paranymphea is that it is a Paleocene indicator fossil. So
Oh.
yes, so you don't have Paranymphea in the Cretaceous, but but you do find it in the very earliest Paleocene. So it's a really pretty leaf. It's mostly found from leaves. But yeah, so that's a cool fossil that's often, if you are using fossil plants to do relative dating on a site, Paranymphea is an example of, we know we're in the Paleocene. Bye-bye dinosaurs, except for birds.
Okay.
But unfortunately, there's not a lot. Another one that I like is, I am admittedly biased, is Florasantia.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Florasantia is a beautiful flower. So, it is exceptional. You have fantastic preservation, and it is found at the Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument, where I was once an intern, and it is beautiful. So if you ever look up pictures of Florasantia, the preservation is fantastic, and it's just a really pretty flower because it looks like it could have just fallen off of a tree and landed on a rock, and look, Florasantia.
We'll see if we can get pictures of these plants for the blog posts. So check out that in the blog post, listeners. So here's a question that perhaps you just answered. Do you have a favorite fossil angiosperm?
Oh.
I know. See, I did it again.
I know. You'd think I would have figured it out. Okay, so I do have a soft spot for Florasantia. Oh, that's hard. So I work with fossil angiosperms.
Yes.
Most of mine, taxonomy is really hard. Like I said, the part of a plant that is most likely to be preserved is the leaf. The worst way to identify a plant is with the leaf. So I don't know the names of a lot of my fossils, but so my fossils, I say mine, so the fossils that I study specifically are from the early Miocene of Kenya, Rusinga Island, Kenya, and I have some fossil, they are probably closely related to like acacia. So
Okay. We know how much you like acacia.
I love acacia. I lied. Acacia is my favorite angiosperm. How can I forget? Acacias literally make me cry. I love them so much. But I have these fossil acacia leaves, and they're really cute because they're not very big. They're just these little tiny leaflets all over on my rocks.
Adorable.
They are adorable.
Would you be able to send us some pictures of those so that we could put them in the blog post?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
After, well, we'll remind you afterwards. Yes.
Yes.
Listeners, check out the blog post.
Yes.
All right. So we've talked about where angiosperms came from. We talked about sort of what we know of the start of angiosperms, what angiosperm fossils are like. But the most perhaps exciting thing about angiosperms isn't, well, we don't know very much about how they got started. So the most exciting thing we do know is what happened after they got started.
Mm-hmm.
Angiosperms, as we discussed in the beginning, have, it is not exaggerative to say, taken over the world.
Literally.
Yes.
Yes, they have the world is overgrown with them. Allie, can you tell us a bit about what is called the angiosperm radiation?
I would love to. So that's when things get exciting for me, because I'm going to be honest, I am biased towards the Cenozoic. So once we get, like, the end of Cretaceous, that's cool, but once we get into the Cenozoic, that's when I get really excited. So in the Cretaceous, so early Cretaceous and into the Cenozoic, we have this widespread radiation. So basically, angiosperms were there in the early Cretaceous, but as you get into the late Cretaceous, they take over. And there's probably a lot of things that are leading to this. So like we mentioned before, you're seeing a lot of changes happening at the end of the Cretaceous. Apart from, a little, meteor incident. Even apart from that, you're seeing these big issues. So you're having these major climatic and tectonic changes. So like the continents are moving. You have these intercontinental seas that are drying up. Therefore you have increased sea level. You have increased CO2, and you have the climate is warming. So things are going nuts. In addition,
nuts are a type of fruit.
It's true.
Things are literally going nuts.
It's true. And so because of this, you're having a lot of disturbance. And angiosperms are good at disturbance. So if you have ever taken an ecology class, you have probably learned about succession. Mm-hmm. And so if you have, something, you have a fire, you have clear cut, something is disturbed, you have succession. You have this pattern of plants that come in and replace what was there before. And by and large, that is dominated by angiosperms, because angiosperms are kind of live fast, die young, except for some of them don't die so young, but they do live fast. So angiosperms tend to be more drought resistance than gymnosperms. They have this, like I said, this weedy life history. They can get in and live anywhere. I mean, you've seen dandelions. They can live anywhere.
Yeah.
And they have really rapid reproduction. So gymnosperms tend to be more of a tortoise. So they live very slowly. They reproduce very slowly. And so if you ever see, if you've ever seen a cycad can be knee high and be hundreds of years old, because they just don't grow very quickly. Whereas an angiosperm, just like, I'm a tree now. It doesn't take very long for them to grow. And in addition, in the late Cretaceous, we have evidence for increased charcoal. And to get charcoal, that means you're burning things. So we have this increased fire. We have these new fire regimes. We were having fire occurring in places and in frequencies that weren't happening before. In response to this, we're having this high productivity because the angiosperms are able to take over after the fire. Again, this succession, which is increasing the biomass, which is also leading to more fire. You got more stuff to burn. And there are many groups of angiosperms that do better when you burn them. And particularly if you think about grasslands. So we're not geologically, we're not to the grasslands yet, but grasslands, if you burn them, that way they are able to grow better. They are able to incorporate that organic material into the soil, and it ends up helping them out. But yeah, having all of these difference in these climatic and tectonic changes, this disturbance, these fires, basically shook everything up. And the angiosperms were like, oh yeah, we got this. This is our time. We've been waiting. And so then that's when you see this huge increase. And they begin spreading and dominating environments that used to be primarily gymnosperms. It's really interesting to see how quickly it happens geologically, because it's basically, and now they're everywhere.
It's the episode of Futurama with the robots that keep evolving overnight. It's just he's going to sleep, waking up, and there's just trees and flowers everywhere.
Yes, basically. Sounds about right.
So the animals at the end of the Cretaceous, again, now the Cretaceous, we're at the end of the age of dinosaurs, end of the age of reptiles, are suddenly surrounded by flowers and fruits.
Yes. So there has been, it has been suggested that there was some coevolution between the fruits and some of the herbivorous dinosaurs. There seems to be less evidence of that than we thought, but it's still a really cool idea, right? So Bob Bakker was one of the first people to suggest this, that you have these big groups, these big dinosaurs, and suddenly you have this very nutritious source of food. Of course they're going to eat it. They're probably not as closely tied as I personally would have liked. But it is really interesting because it's a neat thought experiment that as like towards the end of the Cretaceous, we're having this change in nutrient availability. You have suddenly these much more nutritious plants. If you think about like trying to eat a pine tree, that's not going to go well for you.
Mm-hmm.
But there are, in angiosperms, you can eat the fruit. Sometimes you can eat the flowers. You can often eat the leaves. So they're just, by and large, a better meal. And so it's interesting to think that maybe if dinosaurs hadn't had that bad day on the Yucatan, they might have been able to really utilize that new resource.
So at this point we've been mentioning it throughout the episode. We should specify and be very clear that one of the main purposes of fruit is to be eaten and pooped out.
Yes.
That an animal will eat it, walk across the field, poop the seeds out later, and you have dispersed. And one of the main functions of flowers is to attract pollinators.
Yes.
That you will say, look how pretty and lovely I smell. And bees and flies and butterflies come over and they drink from the flower and they collect pollen and they carry it to another flower. Angiosperms have done one of the most ingenious things that evolution has ever come up with and said, hey, there's all these animals all over the place. Why don't we just start putting our seeds in them
Mm-hmm.
and they will walk around and carry stuff. And that brings us to what my favorite thing about angiosperms is, and that is this very tight coevolution.
Yeah.
Combined is this cooperative evolution with animals.
Yes. And it's amazing because some of it people are very familiar with. So when you think about pollination, when you think about pollinators, it's so commonplace. So gymnosperms are, I think, only wind pollinated. So think about pine trees, just sending out that pollen. If you've ever parked under a pine tree and you come back and your car is yellow, that's why they're wind pollinated. Whereas most angiosperms are far more selective. They're not just like sending out their babies into the ether. They are attracting these pollinators to come to them and make them do the hard work. And it's really interesting because you can actually, by looking at a flower, no pollinators around, you can actually have a pretty good idea of what kind of pollinator will come to that type of flower. So if you think about like hummingbirds have these long bills, and they can hover, and they're very good at detecting the color red. That's why hummingbird feeders are red, because hummingbirds primarily feed on red or reddish flowers. They tend to have these long tubes, and they tend to be oriented in such a way that the hummingbird can feed on it by hovering. So over time, you have this relationship that, hey, when I have flowers that are shaped like this, hummingbirds come to them. I've made all these babies, and they're going to be like that too. Same thing with bees. Flowers that bees come to tend to be more symmetrical, and they tend to be blue or yellow, colors that are easier for bees to see. And often they have these nectar guides that are in ultraviolet, that are basically
yeah,
so
a little runway.
Yeah, so it's basically,
I learned about that in the Magic School Bus.
That's what I was thinking of. That's where I learned it too.
Yep.
Yeah, it's basically just these lines pointing like, get food here, eat at Joe's sort of thing. Which is really cool. And they tend to have flowers that so very often they have flowers that the bee will have to go into. So kind of maneuver into it, and then they'll shake it onto themselves. They'll shake the pollen onto the bee. Butterflies often will go to flowers that have nectar rewards, because that's what butterflies are eating. They're eating this nectar. Moths will go to white flowers that are open at night, because that's when the moths are most active, and that way they can see them in the dark. And they also tend to be very fragrant, because, again, they have to get a moth to find them in the dark. It's similar, that's also true of flowers that are pollinated by bats.
Oh,
Yes.
Okay.
And then you have things that are pollinated by flies.
Yes.
And that's my favorite. They tend to be flat, easy to access, and they smell bad.
Yeah.
Like the Rafflesia flower.
Yes, exactly.
Which, fellow nerds, is what Vileplume is based off of.
Yeah.
The Pokemon, the big red smelly flowers
Yes.
are for attracting flies.
Which completely changes how when I first learned that, completely changed how I viewed him, because he always looks so chipper and happy, and now it's just like
You smell bad.
Smells like death.
he's like that one kid in class that can't smell himself.
Yes.
It's just like, hi guys, what's up?
Well,
Hi, Vileplume.
and it's funny because so corpse flowers don't flower very often. And when they do, they smell so bad. And it's a very slow process. A few years ago, I went to the Missouri Botanical Gardens for research, and I was in the gardens, and they had a corpse flower. And I was there like a week or two before it bloomed. But it was funny because every botanist I talked to was like, "Did you get to smell it?" I'm like, no, I didn't get to smell it.
Yeah. Well, it's got they have such like a fantasy quality, because they only flower so often,
Right.
and they're huge and they smell bad and weird, and they're very unique looking.
Yes.
Like they've got this giant bowl in the middle.
I have a selfie in front of the corpse flower.
Yeah, that's
Very
awesome.
nice.
So yeah, they're cool.
It's so fascinating to think that, right, the angiosperms evolved to take advantage of animals, but to in a way that I can't think of very many animals that do this, where they have evolved to be delicious.
Yeah,
Right.
Like, their whole thing is to say, here is food and you should eat it, and it is me.
yeah,
I am making food and I want you to eat me. And that from there, the plants have continuously adapted to attracting certain animals, and the animals have continuously adapted to feeding on certain plants. And this is what coevolution
Yes.
is, just that incredible evolutionary intertwinement.
and they can just rock it off once they get in a symbiosis to really, really weird relationships.
And it's amazing how specialized they can be. Like, there
Yes.
are flowers that can only be pollinated by one animal. Nobody else fits.
Yeah.
But it is an arms race, because then the pollinator's like, well, I'll just take a little bit more nectar. And the plant's like, no, that's expensive to make, so I'm going to make it harder for you to get the nectar. And it's really interesting.
You got these mixed signals.
Yes, exactly.
It's actually very reminiscent of what we talked about in episode 53, which was the Baculum episode,
Yes!
where we talked about sexual selection
Yes.
and
Yeah.
how you'll have male and female parts evolving to be the perfect balance of welcoming and not welcome. Like,
Yes.
Yeah.
yes, let's mate. Not that much mating. Just the right amount of mating.
Right, exactly. And we've talked about it's not just flowers, right? Because you also have that coevolution with grazers and grasslands
Yes.
that we've talked
Yes,
about
in
before.
episode 38.
Exactly. So you have these groups that again are you have the grazers that are evolving these bigger teeth that they can wear down over time so they can eat these plants that's full of grit. But it's also really interesting because one of my favorite parts of coevolution is the relationship between plants and animals, specifically these animals that originally dispersed these seeds that are no longer here.
Yes. I was thinking about.
I'm so glad you brought this up.
This is my favorite. So, for example, avocados.
Yes, I was.
Yep.
Yep.
This is the normal example. So avocados are a big fruit with a huge seed that needs to pass through the digestive system of an animal in order to naturally sprout. And there's nothing today that is big enough to not choke and die on an avocado seed and let it to pass through its system. Because a jaguar might be big enough, but it's a little bit too big, and that's not what jaguars are ovovit carnivores, so they're not going to be nomming down on avocados.
So avocados are New World. They're in the Americas.
Yes.
Yes.
So like an elephant could do it, but there are no elephants around.
There used to be. There used to be elephants. So that's what probably was eating them. So you have these proboscideans, relatives to elephants. You have things like gomphotheres, which are the shovel-tusk elephants and are my favorite. They are so weird looking and I love them.
Yeah.
But they could very easily eat an avocado and just let it pass on through and keep on trucking through the forest. Also giant ground sloths would have been big enough to do this.
Episode 24.
But even closer to home, so I'm from Michigan, and everything that I know, I relate back to Michigan. So in Michigan, we have the Kentucky coffee tree and the pawpaw, both of which were originally probably dispersed by this mammalian megafauna, by these mastodons and mammoths that are no longer there. So they don't have that natural dispersal method that they used to have. And so many plants, I didn't really talk about this, but many plants do best if they use sexual reproduction. So you're mixing the egg and the sperm, and we mix all the genes together and we make something new. You don't always have to do that though. So you can clone, you can self, where you're using your own sperm and egg, which is interesting. Or you can just propagate vegetatively. So basically just like, I'm gonna put more of me over there. I'm gonna sprout over there. If you ever cut down a willow tree and then not ground up the trunk, the stump after you do it, it's just gonna sprout up more willow tree. That's why you have to use the stump grinder.
Plants never die.
Yeah, the first time I learned that plants could just do that, I immediately went to my botany professor and was like, all right, explain to me why these aren't colonial man of war weird things. Like, what is this monstrosity?
Aliens.
Yes.
Plants are aliens.
Of the candidates for the largest living thing is a grove of, I believe it's aspen, it is colonial, you could say, in that it's vegetatively reproductive. It's just like clone, 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 clone. It's called Pando. But yeah, it's huge. It's a forest that is all genetically identical because it couldn't find a mate. So it's like, fine, I'll make my own. And it will be me.
Which is another horror story.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds...
That's the plant version of gray goo, is what that is.
My favorite sort of... And this is a subject for another episode. The last 20 minutes has been several subjects for other episodes. And this is going to lead into a question for you, Allie.
Okay.
And in fact, I'll start with this question. Are all carnivorous plants angiosperms?
Yes.
Which makes perfect sense because these are plants that evolved to attract pollinators.
Yes.
And a bunch of them have eventually reached the conclusion of, hey, wait a minute. I'm just bringing protein to myself.
Yes.
And so they'll trap insects, usually insects. They'll trap insects. But then, of course, there are insects that have evolved to work their way around that. Yes. There is at least one species of fly, these are hoverflies, that lay their eggs in carnivorous plants, and then the larvae are adapted to avoid getting stuck and digested.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
Now the bugs are taking advantage of the plants, and it's just this ridiculous back and forth with this one shared evolutionary foundation that has given rise to all this insane diversity.
And it's really cool too because there are actually multiple lineages of carnivorous plants. It has come up multiple times. Different groups have been like,
it makes perfect
that's
sense.
a good idea.
With completely different means.
Oh,
That's
I
always
know.
what gets me. Is it's just like, all right, well, they use teeth, so I'm going to use teeth. And it's like, all right, well, I'm just going to be a pitfall. The other one's like, what about glue?
Yes, exactly.
It's just,
have you tried glue? Oh,
Like-
I was gonna say a thing about the megafaunal plant
Yes.
thing.
Mhm.
Before we get too far away from it, the other day at the lab in the Gray Fossil site, one of the volunteers brought me over to his picking station to show me a thorn, and we put it next to a penny This thorn is longer than the penny.
Ooh.
Wow.
It's this like super long thorn, and the volunteer's name is David. He nicknamed it the Mastodon Stabber.
Well, he's not wrong, because
Yeah.
so groups that are related to acacia. So oh, this is the part when I can't remember common names. It's pseudoacacia. Locust, the locust.
Sure.
So the honey locust has these spikes. So basically, if you upset a honey locust, you abuse it in some way, or you graze on it, it will send out these spikes. And it's not just spikes. It's spikes and spikes and spikes and spikes. And they've done studies that showed that in general, plants are able, I believe this is true, that they found like the highest proportion of these spikes that were like basically at mastodon eye level, which is just amazing. At the Waco Zoo, there is a honey locust near the elephant enclosure that is just covered in spikes because the elephants really like it. They won't leave it alone.
That's awesome.
I had one really quick of the animal interactions. My favorite example of the crazy relations, and I don't remember what kind of flower it is, and I remember what it looks like because it was a documentary, but I don't remember what it is, and I don't even remember if it was a bee or some other bug, but it's the one that taps it on the lower back, that has the little part of the flower that actually bends down when the bee shoves its head in.
Yes.
And the pollen is dabbed on the back just a little bit, and so that when it goes to another flower, it actually picks it up off of that spot. A little mechanical feature.
Yes.
What? So the listeners can't see that Will is like a crane arching his hand over to demonstrate.
I'm dabbing my other arm.
See, but now the kids don't think that dabbing means what you're
Dabbing
saying.
means-
I know.
Dabbing's a thing now. You're
No,
like
it is
gently applying.
I never will. I never. They ask me at the aquarium all the time. I never will.
The plant is reaching over behind the animal and gently applying pollen to it.
Smuts.
Speaking of, I have one last question. Speaking of relationships between plants and animals, are all of our common domesticated plants angiosperms?
Yes. So the only domesticated plant that is not an angiosperm is gonna be like Christmas tree farms.
Okay,
That's
what I was thinking.
Yes.
That makes sense.
But all of our crops and
All
stuff,
of our crops are angiosperms.
all the fruits and vegetables and all that are
because we're
angiosperms.
eating.
they're the tasty
Yeah,
plants.
exactly. We're eating the fruits.
Right.
Or sometimes we're eating the leaves, but by and large, we're eating the fruits of the organism. And like I said before, if you eat an angiosperm leaf, you'll probably get some nutrients. If you try to eat like pine needles, you're just gonna have a bad time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not great.
Don't do that.
Allie, thank you so much for sharing with us the wonderful world of angiosperms.
The delicious world.
Yes.
It's very tasty. I was thinking throughout the episode what my favorite angiosperm is.
Yeah, what is it?
And the answer is broccoli. Because that plant, I can't remember what that plant is, but it's
Brassica.
broccoli and cauliflower.
It's the brassica plant.
Yes, there you go. It's like 5 different delicious vegetables are all that plant.
Yes.
And it's wonderful.
Yes. Thanks, brassica.
Watermelons. Watermelons are my favorite.
Oh. So,
That's a good choice.
So
too.
I've noticed a pattern. I like trees. You like food.
I like.
Yes, that is 100%. That is true. My favorite mammals are the tasty ones.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. I like having an excuse to talk about plants.
This is great. Listeners, thank you to everyone who requested this episode. As we would have said, this is one of the most requested topics that we have received on the podcast. Thank you, as always, to our patrons for supporting us. Check out the blog post. There will be pictures and links, and hopefully we'll have Allie send us some photos of her favorite plant fossils so we can put them up. We release new episodes every fortnight, so stick around. 2 weeks from the release of this episode, we'll have another one. And as always, let us know what you want to hear about. If you want, because every now and then people say, I want to hear more about plants.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people even say, I want to hear Allie again.
Yes.
And hopefully this episode has sated those people's desires for knowledge.
now.
for now. Yeah, we're just going to have to keep bringing her back. It's going to be like an addiction.
Please.
Is that it, Will? Have I forgotten anything?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, Allie, thank you once again so much. You will be back, I'm sure,
Oh, I hope
at some
so.
point.
Thank you.
The next time when we do a carnivorous plants episode, hint, hint, listeners, suggest that, please. I would love to
Please
do a
suggest
carnivorous
that.
Yes.
We do actually have a whole bunch of other plant requests, so
Mm-hmm.
there's stuff to do. One last note after this, if you are a patron, we're going to hop on over to the Patreon specific stuff and record some after chat with Allie. So if you want to hear a little bit of bonus discussion, join us on Patreon, or, subscribe to Patreon if you'd like. Other than that, I think we're done. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Ta-ta.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.